On this edition of NTD's International Reporters Roundtable, the stability of the global economy, pandemic recovery, rising inflation, escalating wars, international debt, and climate change measures have made the future uncertain. Our guests Daniel Lacalle, Frank Xie, and Kevin Stockland joined us to discuss if the world's economy is on the brink. Welcome to NTD's International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Don Ma. Right now, the world is facing potential economic instability. Central banks all over the world are fighting inflation, and with the global pandemic behind us, right now we have international debt, threats to commerce, causing geopolitical unrest, coupled with protests, mass illegal migration, climate change measures as well, wars not to mention, that are coming to a boiling point. So what is on the horizon? How stable is the world's economy? It's time to meet our panel. First, we have Daniel Lacalle, PhD, Professor of Global Economy at IE Business School in Madrid, where he is joining us from today. He is a hedge fund manager, speaker, media contributor, and author of 4 best-selling books, including Freedom or Equality, Escape from the Central Bank Trap, The Energy World is Flat, and Life in the Financial Markets. Next, we have Frank Tianxie, PhD, former consultant, now a speaker and business and marketing professor at the University of South Carolina, Aiken. He is the author of The Dragon's Vault, a book on the Chinese economy. Frank is a contributor to the Epoch Times, NTD Television, Radio Free Asia, and Sound of Hope Radio International. And Kevin Stockland, former Wall Street banker, now business reporter for the Epoch Times. He is a filmmaker. His 2008 historical documentary, We All Fall Down, is used to educate campuses around the world about the mortgage crisis, and his recent film, The Shadow State, with Epoch TV, is an expose of ESG investment. All right, let's start with Daniel here. I want to get a baseline view here of the global economy. So I want you to tell us about the state of the global economy, how stable it is, and what direction is it headed in, Daniel?
Thank you very much. Well, what we can say about the global economy is that what we're living is basically the hangover of the monster amount of stimulus packages implemented in 2020. That means persistent inflation, low growth, low productivity growth, and very high debt. Those enormous spending packages implemented by governments all over the world, added to the increase in protectionism, increase in polarization globally, are reducing the level of investment of most economic agents, and at the same time maintaining a level of government spending that, instead of being moderated after the enormous increase of 2020 due to the pandemic, have been consolidated and actually in some cases increased. So all of that means lower growth, lower productivity growth, lower real wage growth for citizens, and diminishing power of the currencies, and therefore an impoverishment of the middle classes, particularly in developed economies.
All right, very concise summary and overview here, Daniel. Of course, we can't talk about the global economy without talking about the biggest ones included in it, which is including the US, Europe, and China, of course. And Frank, that's where you come in, because I want to ask you, what is the inside reality versus external perspective when it comes to China?
Well, China has experienced growth in the past 20 years, mostly since the accession into WTO and opening up of U.S. and European markets to the Chinese manufacturers. But that good old days are gone, basically. And the thing is with China is there's not enough domestic demand for consumptions. the people are not getting richer or as rich as they should be. And the communist elite is getting very, very rich, very quickly. Now, the problem with China is, in addition to the slowdown of economic growth, there's a high inflation. There's also the burst of the bubble, of real estate bubble, and which is huge, much larger than that of Japan in the 90s. And together, with the Chinese government trying to kind of restore the Chinese economy, they resorted to more government spending, government subsidies. That is causing more troubles, as we see now. So, together with the conflicts with the European countries and the U.S., especially with the new stimulus tools that the Chinese government initiated, such what they call the new quality productivity, that is on the EVs, on lithium batteries, and also on the photo industries. So it's basically the high unemployment in China, which is the problem they created because of economic slowdown, is now being shipped overseas. That's the intention of Chinese government, and that's causing a lot of trouble now.
Okay, Kevin, let's talk about the U.S. now. We have rising prices and inflation, shortages, bankruptcies, bank closures. What is the economic status and overview in your perspective when it comes to the United States?
Well, the headline numbers that just came out about the U.S. economy are fairly positive. We're looking at GDP fourth quarter, 3.4% growth rate in the U.S., which is pretty healthy. Unemployment is at 3.8%, so that's back to pre-pandemic levels. Inflation is starting to creep up, but it is still about 3.5%. So, well below the numbers that it was a couple of years ago when it was approaching double digits. That really has to do, and following on what Daniel said, the role of government in the private economy has expanded tremendously since COVID, and that's not going away. So more than 1/3 of GDP, we see good growth numbers, but more than 1/3 of GDP is actually government spending, and that is increasing. Government revenues are increasing more than 4% a year, projected to do over the next few years. So we're seeing the role of government increase faster than private industry. We saw the government budget in the U.S. increase by $2 trillion in 2023. That's an enormous increase. Half of that goes to wealth transfers. But one of the concerns is one of the largest and fastest growing items is the interest that we're paying on our debt. That's growing by about 35% a year. And projections are within the next 10 years, American interest payments will be the largest single item in our budget, surpassing Medicaid and military spending. So how this flows through the economy, inflation, while those numbers are down, cumulatively, it's been 20% inflation since 2020. And so what that means for your average American, they've lost 20% of their savings, of their purchasing power. In order to try to fight inflation, we are seeing an escalation of interest rates. So mortgage rates, which were down as low as 2 or 3% a couple years ago, are now up north of 7%. Car loans for new cars are north of 7%. For used cars, they're north of 11%. And so what this means is basic things like food, fuel, housing, transportation, they are increasingly becoming unaffordable for your average American.
So I see one thing that all of you have mentioned in one capacity or another, and that is inflation. Daniel, I want to go to you now. So are we winning at all in this fight against inflation? I mean, it seems like here in the U.S., at least, from when inflation peaked at around 9%, we're down tremendously compared to that. But what do you think? Are we making progress here?
Well, it depends on how you look at it. From the government perspective, we are making progress. But as I always tell my students, if I gain 10 pounds a year and then I gain 4, I'm not getting any thinner. Inflation is accumulative. So the idea that we are winning on inflation by perpetuating is really dishonest, to be fairly honest, because ultimately what is literally happening is that in the past 4 years, the prices of essential goods and services in America, for example, have risen between 20 to 40%. And when they say that inflation is being contained, is basically just that the increase in prices is moderating its path, but it's not reducing prices. And actually, if we look at the past 6 months in the United States in particular, we can see that all of the items are actually accelerating, except for a couple of them. So I think that that is one of the big concerns, is that the enormous level of government spending, which ultimately deficit spending is printing money for everybody that is watching. The enormous level of deficit spending is generating a higher level of inflation. The so-called Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, or the inflation reduction programs in the euro area, have been actually inflation perpetuating programs. So that means that citizens are poorer. And if we look at the United States, for example, we just saw that in the past 4 years, the average real wage growth has been less than 0.7%. That is almost 2.5 times lower than the previous 4 years, and that's been in a period of recovery. No, so the impoverishment of the middle class is the main consequence of this enormous level of monetary stimulus and fiscal stimulus, which at the end of the day are actually the same. No, so the problem here is to fall into the narrative that inflation is being contained and that there's a big reduction in inflation. We have to look at the trend of the past 3 and the past 6 months, and in that trend, both in the euro area, in the UK, and in the United States, the trend is actually accelerating. And I come back to the point. There's nobody in the United States or in the euro area or in China or anywhere else that looks at the rising in prices at an annualized level. Furthermore, if you allow me, all this message about the reduction in inflation comes after 2 changes in the calculation of CPI. So it's not just that inflation has not been contained, is that the new ways of calculating CPI, and they don't provide homogeneous tables, the new ways have actually helped reduce the percentage in the basket of inflation of those goods and services that matter the most for citizens, like shelter and energy.
Yeah, I mean, those are very good points here, Daniel. And I do want to follow up on that, but we have to take a short break now. But when we return, the question is the global economy on the brink? We'll find out from our panel. Welcome back to NTD's International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Don Ma. We're here with our guests, Daniel Lacalle, Frank Xie, and Kevin Stocklin, discussing the state of the global economy. So real quick, I want to start with you, Daniel, because you were talking about inflation. It's slowing down in terms of growth, but it really hasn't, stopped, right? So are you proposing that we should have disinflation in the global economy?
There is no problem in disinflation. There's no consumer that is watching us that has ever left a supermarket saying, I cannot tolerate it any further, prices are falling. It's ridiculous to complain about disinflation after the enormous level of inflation that we have suffered. So the concept that central banks need to combat deflation is ridiculous to start with, because there is no risk of deflation. But the concept of being worried about disinflation after we have seen prices rising of essential goods and services that move between 20 to 40% in the past 4 years is also ridiculous. So, and more importantly, we need to understand why there is so much discontent with politicians all over the world, very evident in the United States, very evident in the euro area, because citizens are being told that the economy is swimming, that everything is going fantastically, and that inflation is being contained. But everybody, or at least the hardworking families and small businesses, are feeling poorer. So the idea that central banks need to inject further liquidity or cut rates in this scenario makes no sense to me.
All right, Frank, I want to ask you, because we've seen recently that China has actually been battling a bit of disinflation. So I want your reaction on what Daniel has said, but in a China context.
Well, I agree with Daniel that the inflation is the biggest issue here, and you're right, U.S. and Europe, and also it's just that the acceleration of inflation is slowing down. So the inflation itself, if you compare the price level over the past 3-4 years, is for average Americans, we're spending more than 30-40% on the essentials. So it is a big problem. What makes it worse is that the Fed's monetary policies, by increasing the interest rate, does not seem to have the capacity to stop the inflation from keep going up. So that's the biggest problem. And also, I just want to add to what Daniel and also Kevin said earlier, that the low unemployment rate in America, 3.5, 3.8%, it does not seem, is not actually looking as good as it seems to be, because we have seen a decrease in private sector, like high-tech companies, slashing their jobs, and the government positions are going up. In China, the issue is different, somewhat different. We cannot really apply all those Western economic theories to Chinese economy, because it's not a market economy. It's not market economy. It's not driven by market forces, and it's mostly government controlled. Monetary policies and also the Chinese government, the Communist government, is notorious for fabricating the numbers. I don't believe their CPI number, GDP number, even the population number. It's just not cannot be trusted. So the thing is that when they calculate the CPIs, they chose whatever they need they want to put in there. We have seen the housing prices going skyrocketing, and we haven't seen that much reflected in Chinese CPI. So the so-called Chinese deflation, I think, is a hoax. It's not really true. There is the big recession going on, and the prices for major necessities like energy, communications, all those state-controlled sectors are going up. And the only price drop we see is actually in the private sectors, maybe like street vendors, food, where there is more competition among those private small business owners, small stores, food stalls. So we have seen those kind of price drop. That's mostly because of for poor market demand and the fierce competition, and where there's government in control, the price is going up. So the Chinese deflation, we can't just look at it by the number that's reported by the Chinese government.
All right, Kevin, a lot has been said here right now, and I want your reaction. Anything that stood out to you?
Yeah, I think in terms of inflation, I agree with what Frank and Daniel are saying. There's kind of two main issues. One is the geopolitical side. So, the war in Ukraine and the war in Middle East. Russia, for example, is the third largest oil producer, and we've seen quite a lot of success coming from the Ukraine in taking out Russian oil refineries. Currently, what's going on in the Middle East. Maybe that's an actual war, or maybe they're just going through the motions. We have yet to see how that's going to develop. But these two theaters combined could have a tremendous impact on oil, and that flows through the entire economy. But the underlying trend, particularly in the US, I think in Europe as well, is really for much more government intervention into the economy in terms of the energy industry, the auto industry, the electricity utilities and things like this, transitioning away from fossil fuels towards wind and solar. We're seeing quite a pullback in capital investment from the oil industry in terms of new wells, in terms of new refineries. Those things just aren't really getting built. And so as we look ahead, we may see some significant shortages in the oil and the energy industry, and that flows through the entire economy. That flows through farming, price of diesel, the price of fertilizer, obviously to food and transportation and everything else. So I think inflation is far from tamed. And the fact that it's down as low as it is, that may well be the calm before the storm. We'll see what the next few years bring.
So Kevin, you mentioned a couple of things that I found interesting, including clean energy, if you will, electric vehicles, and all that, solar panels. What is your view on this category and its impact on the economy if we go down this road?
It could potentially be enormous. So, we are looking at the EPA passing new regulations to over time phase out gas-fired cars in a number of states. California, Massachusetts, and the list goes on, are looking to ban new sales of internal combustion engine vehicles by 2030 or 2035. I believe a number of European countries have moved or are moving in the same direction. What this ends up being is a tremendous gift to China. Not only does China have a stranglehold on the raw materials that go into batteries, that go into solar panels and wind turbines, whether that's lithium or cobalt or whatever, but China can manufacture electric vehicles at a much lower cost and at relatively equal quality to the West. And so this could put a number of automakers out of business, to the extent that this, let alone that electricity is now becoming much more expensive. Certainly in Europe, we saw, Germany is now paying some of the highest electricity rates in the Western world, and we are certainly headed that direction as well in the United States as we shut down coal plants and gas plants, etc. So the knock-on effects of the economy on jobs, on industry, really could be enormous.
So let me try to get to both of you, Frank and Daniel, before we head on to break. So Frank, one thing that was mentioned by Kevin here was this path towards clean energy requires a lot of materials that actually China has a chokehold on. So I want your thoughts on that. What are your thoughts on all this?
Well, yes, it is true, and then the Chinese government definitely sees that as the opportunity. That's why Xi is proposing this new quality productivity to boost China's position. Especially they already have good position in the the solar panel industry, but they are trying to gain upper hand on the batteries and newer batteries, and also on the EVs, right? And the thing is, we have to realize that the whole EV industry is actually boosted mostly by ideological, of the left, ideologies of the left. We're seeing that the EV is actually not that environmental friendly. So, and also with the lack of the charging stations and the infrastructures, and also the cost. Another problem is the cost and the pollution associated with producing those car batteries and the disposal of that. That seems to be a big issue. So I think the overall push for more EVs is mostly driven by politics, the leftist, ideologies, I think that it has to come to it has to slow down somewhat. So I think there's even the automakers, they are actually giving up like the Mercedes and Toyota, they're giving up their once ambitious plan to turn to EV. So it is changing, but still that's where the contention is going to be between US, China, and the European Union with regard to that EV production and export.
Right. So Daniel, we'll come back to you after the break, but we have to take a short commercial break now. When we return, another question is, how is geopolitical unrest affecting the global economy? Stay tuned to find out. Welcome back to NTD's International Reporters Roundtable. I'm Don Ma. Daniel, so we left off with Frank, so I'm going to you now. What are your thoughts on this path down clean energy and its impact on the economy?
Well, I think that the bad thing about this path that we are pursuing is that it's politically led and not technology or industry led. Therefore, it's creating enormous levels of problems all over the world. The clearest example is Germany, as Kevin was mentioning. In Germany, they decided to shut down the nuclear terminals, and now they consume more coal than they consumed 20 years ago after 500 billion euro of subsidies for solar. So what we are seeing is uh, the lack of understanding of the energy world by politicians that simply set themselves with a target and then fail to understand the consequences. And the consequences are phenomenal. To start with, the energy transition, the way that it's been designed, requires multiple times over the level of mining of copper and rare earths and other essential elements in order to start to be achieved. And at the same time, regulation is putting more and more brakes, as Kevin was mentioning and Frank was mentioning as well, on the lending for mining. So it makes no sense whatsoever. The second problem is that by deciding to impose a percentage of electric vehicles, etc., what they're not taking into account are the phenomenal problems that are included with them. No, an electric vehicle requires 8 times more copper than a combustion engine vehicle, and they're not taking into account what is going to happen with the batteries once the useful life is over. None of that is being taken into account. It's all being driven by ideology and not driven by industry and technology. And we all defend the technological improvement that may come from the implementation of clean energies once they're fully developed. But for that, you need innovation, competition, and technology. And through subsidies and government intervention, what is actually happening is that they are putting a brake on innovation. Because it's ridiculous to think that in less than 10 years, we saw the batteries of mobile phones go from suitcases this size to this, and solar panels continue to be exactly the same as they were 10 years ago. So, in fact, this entire politically driven policy, what is actually doing is putting brakes on innovation that would actually find the solution to all these resource and availability problems that we were mentioning. So, and more importantly, if I may, is that they're achieving the opposite effects of what they want to achieve. Is that instead of reducing the use of carbon and the emission of CO2, what they're actually doing is increasing the use of coal. Instead of reducing the cost and the affordability of vehicles, what they're doing is increasing them. And more importantly, the level of contamination in developed economies has not even started to improve. So it is nonsensical, to be fairly honest, and exceedingly expensive for the consumer.
All right, before we went to break, I mentioned geopolitics. So let me talk about what's happening right now with the situation in the Middle East. One of the bigger concerns here is will oil be impacted? So Kevin, let me go to you now. What are your thoughts on everything that's happening? Is the war itself in the Middle East going to impact the global economy?
I think what we're seeing in the Middle East has been a reminder to investors that there is geopolitical risk, and stock market investors aren't all that good in pricing that in, and they tend to be surprised when things happen. And so I think we're seeing a new awareness that there is geopolitical risk. We have yet to see this situation fully develop. It may be that cooler heads prevail in the Middle East, and we can get on back to business as usual. Saudi Arabia seems to have been generally supporting Israel, or at least assisting Israel in blocking some of the attacks from Iran. And the efforts so far from both Israel and Iran to attack each other have been fairly half-hearted. So it may be that this situation calms itself. We have yet to see how it plays out, but I think we are seeing a new awareness in both Europe and the Middle East that geopolitical risk is a factor, and we are seeing the stock market start to take notice of that.
And Frank, it's not just the war in the Middle East, nor is it just Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but Taiwan is also another topic of discussion when we're talking about wars. If China decided to invade Taiwan, what are your thoughts on the impacts of the global economy on that front?
It will have a huge impact on the global economy, especially in the semiconductor business. That the Taiwan's TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, is the largest, chips manufacturer in the world. And if China attacks Taiwan, there will be a huge disruption in supplies, of those TSMC chips to the countries worldwide, worldwide. The thing is, I know the U.S. is trying to build a new TSMC plant in Arizona, in the U.S., hoping to kind of like avoid such a situation. But the plant is still, under construction. It's far from being completed. And also, I think the situation with Taiwan is, with China is that the Chinese government may not resort to the blatant military invasion to conquer Taiwan. Instead, they could use other ways. And in my view, I think it's more likely that they can use exercises, military exercises to interfere, to intimidate, to disrupt the supply of energy to Taiwan, and to cause internal turmoil in Taiwan society. And then we have seen that there are many communist cells or communist synthesizers in Taiwan, and they could play a role in helping the Chinese government to take over Taiwan without using military force. So that's what I'm more concerned. We know the Taiwan's new president, Lai Ching-te, is going into office in May, and this could be a potential big risk point where China may do something to interfere, to intimidate, or just to cause turmoil in Taiwan economy and also the supply of semiconductors to the world market.
Sure. So Daniel, I know you're short on time now, so I want you to have the last word here. A lot of topics discussed so far in our show. What do you think is the biggest threat to the global economy here?
I think that all the things that we have been mentioning in the show lead to one word, which is polarization. I think that what we are seeing is that the global economy is becoming less open, less at least able to see it from a stable point of view. That generates enormous levels of disruption. And that polarization is not just coming from the geopolitical unrest, which Kevin and Frank have mentioned beautifully, and I completely agree, but also from the rise of protectionism. I am extremely worried about the rise of protectionism. In the European Union, we are seeing an implementation of massive protectionist measures that are disguised under environmental issues. In the United States, we have seen a very significant number of measures implemented to block or at least put barriers to free trade. All those things mean less growth and less real wages and more inflation. But I think that I am very worried because Frank and Kevin have mentioned two very important things, is that the market is completely ignoring geopolitical risk. We're looking at markets right now as we speak. I'm looking at my Bloomberg screen, and I'm seeing that oil is not reacting whatsoever to the rising geopolitical tensions, that markets continue to be valued at massive levels of multiple expansion, and that there is in general a type of let's say blissful ignorance based simply on the idea that the Fed is going to cut rates. So to me the biggest risk may come actually from suddenly a realization from market participants that whoops, they have taken way too much risk and accumulated way too much risk for too little return, thinking that nothing was going to happen.
Okay, it's time for a break now, but when we come back, we'll conclude our panel on the state of the global economy. Daniel, this is all the time I think you have for us. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Now we're returning to conclude our panel on the state of the global economy with our guests, Frank Xie and Kevin Stocklin. So Frank, let me start with you right now. Before Daniel left, he mentioned some potential threats that he thinks is very important to the global economy. And I want to get your thoughts on this as well. What is the biggest threat right now that you see?
Well, I agree with Daniel on what he said about the polarization and the rearrangement or shift in power alignment and in among those world powers. But I have to emphasize one point, that is the role of communism, the communist China. We have seen that in the war between Russia and Ukraine, and China is behind the Russian. I know we know China is definitely behind Iran in many things by supplying Iran with the money they need, and also could be, I believe there also could be potential military technologies or even hardwares involved with the Iranian arsenal. So, and also obviously with a potential conflict in Taiwan Strait or in South China Sea, there is also the role to play by the Chinese communists. So globally, we can see that even in the United States, and the current government administration is clearly in line with most of the leftist and socialist agenda, and that also can be said about the role of communism playing a role in American politics. So we can see this globally. In addition to what Daniel said, the polarization or reshifting, realignment of world powers, and there's also the role played by the communists, worldwide.
So Kevin, a number of factors here. We have wars, we have green energy, inflation, geopolitics, and of course, as Frank just mentioned, now communism. What are your thoughts? Biggest threat?
Certainly, were China to move against Taiwan or Russia to get significantly more aggressive in Europe, then I think we're living in a new world. And I think then all bets are off. But Frank, you make an excellent point about the trends and the underlying trends. And what we're seeing is a new fascination and support among those in power for central control of the economy and of citizens. And what that means for your average citizen is really they are being disenfranchised from their own decisions. So they are being forced to buy vehicles that they don't necessarily want. They're watching their energy system being transitioned away from something that's abundant and affordable to something that they probably cannot afford, that will not provide them energy and electricity reliably. Consumer items, whether that's dishwashers or refrigerators or lawnmowers, their ability to choose there is also being taken away from them. And to the extent that we're seeing these edicts not be approved by lawmaking bodies, by legislatures, by anything that people have a vote in, but rather by administrative fiat from the EPA, from the Department of Energy, from the Biden administration, et cetera. People don't have a say in any of that. They have no vote in what the EPA decides. These are all being decided by bureaucrats and handed down to people, and our only role is to follow them. So massively, we are seeing a disenfranchisement of individual citizens from their economy, from the political system, and really from major decisions in their own lives. And that, I think, is a major underlying trend of the economy. Command and control systems tend to be incapable of matching supply and demand. And so you tend to see shortages, you tend to see tremendous waste. This tends to create inflation, and it lowers living standards. And I think this is a grinding, slow process that we are going to see year after year in the coming decades.
And that's a very important point here, Kevin. And I want to follow up with this thought. The U.S. election in November. Can you comment on the dynamic between that and the U.S. economy and the larger economy as a whole?
I think, we certainly have ideological differences, but economically, we seem to have one candidate that wants to remove regulation, lower regulation, particularly in the energy sector, but also in the automotive sector and throughout the economy. And so I think there's one party that does want to significantly deregulate this economy and give choices back to consumers and producers and voters. The other party is very much in favor of central control and industrial policy. And so the nation is going to make a choice this fall which direction we want to go in, and we'll see how that goes.
And Frank, I feel a common theme that has popped up in our discussion today is what government sees as how the economy is doing and what the average citizen is feeling. Do you feel that here in the U.S. That there's a disconnect between government data and reality?
Well, it seems to be, at least on the unemployment rate and number, or we have seen the government focus on the overall unemployment rate is still low, which is low, But on the consumer side, we feel more we can see more high-tech companies laying off people, that affects lots of people. And also we see the government employment is going up. So, and that makes, of course, some people happy, but many others unhappy. But as the other guest has said, like Kevin said, I think inflation is really the key. After all, in this election, eventually the two candidates, in the final face-off, they can have to say, is the economy stupid? So it is the economy, and the people do feel the pain of inflation. I think it's a good example. Daniel said, we already gained 10 pounds in weight. Maybe next year I'll gain 5 pounds, 3 pounds. We're still getting, heavier instead of lighter. So I don't think even with Trump win in November, I'm sure he will keep his promise of open drilling and keep the get the oil price down, and also U.S. more independent for imported oil. But the price level of all things, everything is already up, way up, 30-40% up. So we with oil, more drilling, more oil, our oil price down into 2025, we may see a slowing down in the oil price. But I don't think we're gonna go back to where we were, that price level in 4 years ago.
So Kevin, same question to you. It appears that, just looking at the surface here, the U.S. economy, we have the stock market, S&P 500 rallying for the past 5 months straight. It has cooled a bit recently, and we look at the jobs report, very solid, most people would say. But why is it that if you look at small business sentiment, it's at a low point? And if you look at how people see how the economy is doing in the polls, how Biden is handling the economy, that's also low. Why is it that there's this sort of appears to be a disconnect?
A lot of it comes back to what Frank had just mentioned. So I think the public is very skeptical about these official numbers on inflation. You know, we're hearing that this is all good news and we're supposed to be happy about it. Yet people go to the grocery store and they can't afford to buy meat, and everything that they look at, you know, prices have gone up way more than what the official figures suggest. You know, as far as small businesses, they are also going to get hit, and we're going to see more of that because of interest rates. So any company that's borrowed money that has those loans now rolling over, they might have done a 5-year loan or a 7-year loan, you know, and they might have borrowed that money at 2 or 3%. They're going to have to roll those loans over at 7%, 8%, you know, who knows how much. And that is going to hit the bottom line. Anything in commercial real estate, small business, et cetera, that is going to hurt their cash flow quite a bit. So it's a combination of just the loss of living standard from the depreciating value of the dollar to the fight to try to contain inflation. It's hurting people, it's hurting businesses, it's particularly hurting small businesses, and we're going to see more of the effects of that.
All right, we just have about a minute left before we have to wrap up, and I want to leave off this question with you guys, and that is your outlooks. Let me just quickly start from you, Frank. What is your outlook on the global economy or the U.S. economy?
For U.S. economy, I think you know, well, this is the election year, so after the election, we may see some changes in the directions we're going, right? As to global economy, I think we're going to see more of economic wars or trade wars that's looming, you know, especially between U.S. and China over those EVs and other sectors. And with the geopolitical shift in powers and wars going on, and the economic wars, you know, is going to fire up, I believe, in the coming year.
Right. Okay, Kevin, last word goes to you. Same question, about 30 seconds.
Yeah, you know, China certainly has its issues, and Europe does as well. I'm very optimistic about the U.S. economy. We are doing very well in terms of population, certainly a tremendous abundance of resources and quite a lot of innovation. Manufacturing is starting to move back to the U.S. I think if the United States can make good decisions in the coming years and get the government to step back from attempting to control the economy, I would be very optimistic about the U.S. economy in the coming years.
Great. And with that, it concludes our discussion today. Thank you very much to all of our guests, Frank Xie, Kevin Stocklin, and of course, Daniel Lacalle.
Thank you.
Thank you, Don.
Finally, to all you brave journalists out there honoring our journalistic golden rule, seek the truth and report it. Thank you. I'm Don Ma. Appreciate you tuning in today on International Reporters Roundtable. Until next time, goodbye.